Now, let's look at capitalism. Because so far I've been telling you why I think that there is no capitalism in standard mainstream economics. I want to begin with a distinction that I already made, and I want to make once more. Capitalism is not markets. Societies always had markets. The Phoenicians had markets, the ancient Greeks had markets. They were not capitalist societies. They were societies with markets. Something happened towards the end of the Middle Ages and was elevated to a higher echelon towards the end of the 18th century in Amsterdam and in Britain, that transformed society from being a society with markets to being a market society. And by that, what I mean was to start the process where almost everything was commodified. Before that, land was not for sale. You either inherited land, or you were a peasant, a landless peasant, or sometimes, if you raised an army, you conquered land. There was no real estate market, the classifieds. There was no labor market. Either you worked for some baron, okay, and if you opposed that social arrangement, your head was removed from your shoulders, okay, or you never worked because you were the baron. There was no labor market. You couldn't quit, say, look, I don't want to be your peasant, I'll be somebody else's peasant. So the creation of labor markets, of real estate markets, of capital markets, is a very recent phenomenon, and that's capitalism. For the purposes of what I want to say today, I want to home in on a particular year, quite early in the piece. It's the year 1599. On the day or week when William Shakespeare, was at his theater struggling to complete Hamlet, something remarkable happened. The first joint stock company was founded. The first company whose shares were tradable and anonymous, where you could buy a share without declaring who you are, and if I bought it from you, I could sell it to somebody else as if it was a piece of paper. It was called the British India Company. Within 3 years, the British India Company had effectively destroyed all the markets in India and had taken them over with an army of 200,000 soldiers, much larger than Britain's army or France's army. That was one company. You're familiar with the story. Tradable shares unleashed a very powerful genie that had a capacity to turbocharge and weaponize capital formation. It was an essential moment. Then you had the period of the late 18th century, early 19th century, very tepid capitalism. When Karl Marx was writing his wonderful Communist Manifesto, the first 4 pages is the greatest eulogy for globalization ever. He talks about the way in which the bourgeoisie is, through the spread of global markets, battering down the Chinese walls of prejudice and liberating people from wrong conceptions of the universe and of themselves. It wasn't happening. That was in the imagination of Karl Marx. It happened much later. Much later. He was prescient. Right? When did it really happen? It happened after the 1870s, when Maxwell came up with his wonderful equations of electromagnetism. Those equations that blended, unified the theory of magnetism with the theory of electricity gave rise to what we know now as capitalism. Because it was the basis for telecommunications, electricity, okay, the radio, and of course, and that is crucial, the networked firm. When Thomas Edison invented the lamp, the electric lamp, immediately in his mind he had the power station that produces electricity. And he was the first one to create a totally vertically integrated, gigantic monopoly. From the factory that pumps out the electricity, owning the grid, the cables that go through people's homes and businesses, all the way to the electric lamp and the oven in the kitchen. Now, of course, the reason I'm mentioning that is because here we have the true nature of capitalism, which is not the competitive capitalism that Adam Smith had imagined of the baker, the brewer, and the butcher, whose small family-owned businesses compete with one another, converting private vices into public virtues. No. Here you have monopoly capitalism. The profit margins of the networked firms, whether this was railroads or, telephone companies or electricity grids. And then, of course, Henry Ford comes in with mass manufacturing of automobiles and other products. These huge economies of scale and network economies do two things. Firstly, they make sure that this competition is a joke. Okay? Rivalry, yes. You have General Electric pushing for a particular kind of current, the alternative current, and DC is what Edison. So there's like the Soviet Union versus the United States, not like the butcher against another butcher. The network company, by its very construction, was extremely expensive to fund. No bank had the capacity to forward to Edison the money he needed to build that structure, that network. So what happened? The mega firm gave rise to the mega bank. Consolidation of different banks into hyperbanks. And where did they find the money? The hyper, because if you and I get together, even if 100 of us get together, we put 10 euros together, we don't have the capacity to fund a network company. So the money came out of, as John Kenneth Galbraith once said, if people understood where money comes from, there would be a revolution. Came from thin air. So effectively, the mega banks got together, they had enough political power to offer the mega firms credit lines. So the money was fictitious. It was a little bit like the mega bankers pushing their hand through the membrane of the timeline into the future, grabbing value that has not been created yet, bringing it here, giving it to Edison to produce the value that will repay the future. And if you can do that, that's like having an ATM in your own living room. But of course, the more you reach out to the future and bring it to the present, the more difficult it is for the present to repay the future. At some point there is a crash, 1929. And then, of course, we know what happened in the 1930s. I don't want to get stuck into this. But I want to take you to the golden era of capitalism, which began with Bretton Woods in 1944, and which lasted for two decades, not even 2 decades, let's say 2 decades. This was the only time when unemployment crashed to 2%, inflation was between 2 and 2.5% everywhere, in Europe, in Japan, in the United States, in Canada. And for the first time, something that matters to us today, inequality dropped profoundly. For the first time and last time. That system was predicated upon a single currency. The euro is not the first single currency. The gold standard was the first single currency. And the Bretton Woods system effectively replaced gold with the American dollar. So we were all dollarized after the Second World War. That's what happened, especially this country, okay, and my country, to some extent, okay? But that dollar zone, which was global capitalism, was predicated upon a constant surplus recycling by the American economy. The Marshall Plan is just one example. It was not philanthropy to Germany, to Greece, and to Europe. It was not just a mechanism for subduing the Soviet Union. It was that as well. But it was a very smart and deliberate process of taking the surpluses of the only surplus economy at the time, the United States, bringing them here to finance the aggregate demand which was necessary to buy the net exports of the United States. That system collapsed. Why? Because Germany rose up, Japan rose up, and the United States became a deficit country. And at that point, unlike Europe, you know, the Americans are far more pragmatic than we are. When they see that a design of theirs no longer works, do you know what they do? They destroy it. Whereas we keep hanging on. Remember the exchange rate mechanism? We were hanging on for dear life until the very end. The euro now, we're hanging on with the euro, with the same structure of the euro, even though we know it's not working. You have negative interest rates that are destroying your banks. But it's business as usual. The Americans don't do business as usual. When their own design, even if they love it, like Bretton Woods, doesn't work, okay, they kick it out. And they replace it with the opposite surplus recycling mechanism. They use their trade deficit in order to turn the American economy into a huge vacuum cleaner that was sucking into the territory of the United States the net exports of Germany, of Holland, of Italy, of Japan, and of course later China. And how were they paying for it? Your industrialists, your bankers were sending 70% of their profits to Wall Street. That's how they paid for it. The Chinese, they bought bonds, they invested in America. The Japanese, the same. So that was a very disequilibrium situation, but a stable one. Or you can think of it as a stable disequilibrium or an unstable equilibrium. Choose your language, the same situation. And that crashed and burned in 2008. This is where we are now. We're experiencing a crisis of capitalism that takes different forms in different parts of the world. In some parts of the world, it's negative interest rates. In other parts of the world, it's very high unemployment. In other parts of the world, it is the bubble of private credit in China. But all these are different manifestations of the same crisis. You know, in Australia, there were floods 2 years ago in North Queensland and forest fires in Siberia. Okay? One was flood, the other was fire. They were both the results of climate change. They were the same crisis. In the same way that you have negative interest rates strengthening the alternative for Deutschland, in Greece we have whatever we have. I'm not going to go into it, it's too depressing. The network company, with digitization, has become a total and complete monster. Take Facebook. Facebook is a separate world. Huh? Anybody who goes into Facebook leaves capitalism behind, leaves society. You enter a world created by software, which is a gigantic economy, right? And there's no competition. It's owned by Zuckerberg. They charge you for, advertising events like this. They charge politicians for pushing their political campaigns. They have a remarkable behavior-altering mechanism. The only reason why two of you can communicate through some kind of app or software application is because somebody thinks they can manipulate you. And you know what? They are right. And they do manipulate all of us. We have been proletarianized without realizing it. We all work posting stuff, on Twitter, on Facebook, and so on. What is the capital of Facebook? It's your posts. That is the proportion of the... do you know what is the proportion of Facebook's revenue paid to its workers, to its design? Do you know what it is? 1%. Even Walmart, that is the most exploitative large company in the world, pays 40% of its revenues to its workforce. Facebook only pays 1% because all of you work for Facebook. And you don't even know it. You are simultaneously the proletarian and the consumer. This is remarkable. This is not capitalism in Facebook. It's like the Soviet Union. It's Gosplan. There are 3 people who make all the decisions. And they are far smarter than the Soviet Union was, because the Soviet Union had to have the KGB, they had to threaten you, they had to send you to the Gulag if you didn't behave. Facebook doesn't need to do that. They don't need to do what the British India Company did, which is to have 200,000 soldiers. They have the American army. American capitalism, whenever there's a problem, they send the troops. And they're paid by the taxpayers, and some of them by us in Europe, or by Saudi Arabians, or whoever. So it's important, whatever your politics are, just to forget for the moment the economics without capitalism, because there is a real beast called capitalism that is doing things to our lives, and whose crises jeopardize both the planet and our soul. Back in the 1970s, I was always a leftist. Back in the 1970s, I remember the great conflict, political conflict, ideological battle, was between free marketeers who believed that the free market is a fantastic device for coordinating our preferences and allocating our resources, okay? But the objective was the satisfaction of the sovereign agent's preferences. My preferences were mine. My life was mine. I finished work at 5 o'clock, 9 to 5 work, then I worked in order to do what I want as a human being. Now what we have is a situation where, with digitization, young people, most young people fall in 2 categories. Either those without a trust fund who have to face the prospect of precarious work for 20 years, okay? Or some of them who, maybe because they have some skills, maybe they have a lot of social capital, they are much more connected to the high value-adding businesses. But even they have constantly to worry when they go to an interview. They know that the interviewers are going to check their social media. They need, I meet young people who are constantly worried, have they found their vocation? Because they go to interviews, and now there are these very, very modern-sounding interviewers who say to them, we want you to come and work for us if it's your passion. So they start worrying, what is my passion? And they're constantly trying to discover passions. They go to shrinks, they buy self-help books. This autonomy of the liberal individual has gone. Everybody now is trying to emulate everybody else's view of what should their passion be. That is a kind of tyranny that the KGB could never imagine. It's too cruel even for the KGB. Because, even when you are a prisoner of the KGB or the Greek right-wing fascist dictatorship when I was growing up, even in the cell, you were in command of your own faculties, and you knew who you were. And they couldn't, as Immanuel Kant would say, they couldn't take this autonomy away from you, however small the cell in which you were incarcerated. Today, we're all free in the land of the unfree. That's, for me, where capitalism is. As for democracy, where do I start laughing? The technostructure, the network firms, the hyperbanks, they own, don't worry, they own our politics. If you look at the way in which the powers that be in the European Union took 3.6 trillion since 2010, if you want, we can break it down. 3.6 trillion to save the banks. And now they're nitpicking over climate change. We have the Green Deal of the new president of the European Commission, who is promising 100 billion a year, and she only has 7.5 billion. The rest is going to be conjured up from thin air in the same way Juncker was going to conjure up stuff. Let me now finish up with the last part, markets without capitalism. My critique of capitalism is that liberal capitalism is not possible. Never was, never will be. It is just an ideology. It has as much to do with reality as Marxist emancipation theory had to do with the Soviet Union. Zero. If we're going to save markets, because you say, I believe in markets. Markets for potatoes. Huh? We need to liberate them from the 1599 moment. Have you heard of companies like BlackRock, State Street, Fidelity? Do you know that they own 90% of the corporations that feature in the Standard & Poor's 500 in the United States? From airlines to JP Morgan to Google. We're talking about two guys, it's not girls. Maybe there's a token girl somewhere. They control 90% of capitalism. What is the connection between this and Adam Smith? Zero. As a recent study showed, that where airlines compete that belong to the same mega equity firm, when they compete, prices go up by 5% because they collude. Because the CEOs of all these airlines have to report to the same financier. So this is the point I'm making, that if you really want markets and you don't want central planning, you better do away with the model of capitalism we have, because it is centrally planned. There can be no more centralized system than the one we have. So what would a world look like where markets breathe in the absence of capitalism? Allow me to finish off, and then we start the conversation. With a dream. Can I have a dream moment, please? Will you allow me? The dream is multifaceted, but I'll just stick to 3 points now. Imagine a corporation where there's no boss. You enter, you are hired by a committee, a search committee that go together because they wanted an economist, they wanted a graphic designer. So some of them form the committee, they interview 20 people, they hire you. You get 1 share for the company. You can't buy any. It's like a library card. You come to the university, you get a library card, whether you like it or not. And that gives you a vote for everything. You vote for the distribution of the revenues of the firm between research and development, what the basic income should be, and also you vote for bonuses. Not everybody gets the same, but how do you vote for bonuses? Do you remember the Eurovision Song Contest? Imagine everybody getting 100 bonus points, votes, and you can distribute them to any of your colleagues in proportion to your estimation of their contribution to the company. Yeah? And then when the tally of votes is in, everybody gets a percentage of the bonus fund in proportion to the votes they got from their colleagues. And when you leave the company, you take the accumulated capital, depending on your years and the bonuses you have, and you take it to whichever company. You form another company with friends, or you join another such cooperative company. Now, that's not pie in the sky. I've worked for such a company in Seattle, in Washington State. This is exactly how it worked. 330 people sharing 1.2 billion revenues. I'm not talking about some kind of rickety cooperative. Imagine further that each one of us had a bank account, a triple bank account comprising 3 sub-accounts with the European Central Bank. A digital one. You'd never have to go to Frankfurt. Who wants to go to Frankfurt when they are in Tübingen? Right? One part of the account is a trust fund for every baby. A certain sum of money goes into that fund by the central bank to every newborn. The second one is where your bonuses accumulate. And the third one is where a universal basic dividend flows in. Well, a dividend of what? By the way, before I answer that question, the moment you have that, the banks die. There is no need to have commercial banks. It's a free, digital bank account. Why on earth would you want to have an account in Deutsche Bank to pay their fees? And also, investment banking has already died, because if you've banned tradable shares, if you reverse the mistake of the British India Company of 1599, and you have one share, one worker, shareholding together with private commercial banking producing money out of thin air, those two combine to create investment banking. Once you have no tradable shares and you have free banking, investment banks have no purpose anymore. There is a very boisterous bank for debt, for private debt. So what happens is your savings, you can, through this digital network, there can be some brokers as well, you can lend it to other companies, you can lend it to anyone. But it is money you've already earned. It's not money that's created from thin air. And finally, land. Imagine that every municipality has a citizens' assembly whose job is to divide the land in two lots. One is a commercial zone and the other is a social zone. The commercial zone is exploited commercially through markets in order to make money, to build social housing in the social zone and social enterprise space. And how does the commercial zone work? Full-fledged markets, totally neoliberal markets. This is what I'm proposing. What do I mean by that? Imagine you have a building, you have your company, or a residential house. Maybe you don't want to live in social housing. Maybe you have enough money accumulated. You want to live in a house of your choice in the commercial part. Yeah? Every 1st of January or first week of January, you have to go into a website and you have to declare what you think, your estimate of the commercial value of the properties. And you pay a rent or a tax, land tax, proportional to your declaration of what you think the value is. Of course, that means that you have an incentive to give a very low valuation. No, because there's a second rule. Anyone can come and bid for your home or your place of work, your office space, and if they outbid you, you're out within 6 months. So now you have an incentive to push it up. And all those rents accumulate to be a universal basic dividend and to pay for social housing. Now, the reason why I'm telling you all this is because I want to open your imagination up to how you can have fully fledged markets without capitalism. That, I think, is a nice juxtaposition against the economics without capitalism that students are taught. Thank you.
Thank you a lot for your talk tonight. We collected several questions from the audience, and we want to ask you the questions now. I'm going to read the first one, and then Nikolai is going to go on. The example of your dream of a flat hierarchy obviously is convincing, but how can we manage to break the power of global capital to realize it on a transnational scale?
Do you remember Occupy Wall Street? It was fun, but it was pathetic. Or the Indignados in Madrid and Barcelona, or us in Greece, in Syntagma Square. We had fun. Night after night after night, we protested. We had assemblies. Everybody spoke. It was, reminded me of Oscar Wilde saying socialism would never happen because the discussions take too long. Right? But it was completely ineffective. People got tired, we went home, and the bankers were bailed out anyway, so nothing changed. Now, I I loathe violence. I don't like revolutions because I just get scared of what will happen. I mean, I've been in, on streets where the demonstrations were getting ugly, and I didn't like it. Maybe I'm a coward, right? But if you look at all the revolutions that have taken place, they've eaten the children up and produced a lot of despotism, tyranny. But imagine a completely different digital campaign. Imagine that somebody, maybe you, maybe us, Diem, organized a day of inaction vis-à-vis Amazon, that we organized a global strike by consumers. You know, on Tuesday, such and such, yeah? We're not going to visit the Amazon website, none of us, just one day. Do you know what this is going to do to Amazon? And imagine we had rolling such strikes. And imagine if some of the employees of Facebook or Amazon joined us, because they are very badly exploited, most of them, very few of them get decent wages. And imagine that they faced a double strike by consumers. No, we'd have to do it. It wouldn't really hurt us. We just wouldn't buy anything from Amazon for a day or two, or a week. I can live without buying anything from Amazon for a week, okay? Imagine a campaign that also involved financial engineering. I believe in financial engineering. So, you know, when they privatized, the neoliberal drive towards privatizing water, electricity, everything, you know that the worst aspect of it was that they securitized the future income stream of these companies. So all the electricity bills that you're going to pay until you die have already been purchased in the form of CDOs by some company somewhere, right? So the company that bought the public utility got Goldman Sachs to create a contract where what they did was they said, okay, we project that over the next 30 years, these are going to be the revenues of the company from the electricity bills. So you take this huge amount, you cut it up in small, tiny pieces. You do the same thing with returns from railways, from water, from whatever. And then you create little packages, the CDOs, that comprise different parts of these chunks of different future income streams. Okay? And those CDOs sell like hotcakes. And the companies that buy them for two reasons. Firstly, to receive the revenues that those chunks of property rights generate within, and also because they think that if the value of the CDO goes up, they can sell it and make some surplus value. Imagine if we had smart financial engineers who knew what was inside each one of those CDOs and said, okay, people of Tübingen, okay, if you delay paying your bills for a month, okay, it's not going to be a huge penalty that you suffer. We can crowdfund and give you the money for the payment. But today it will be Tübingen, tomorrow it will be Freiburg, day after it will be Leipzig, Paris, and so on. Together with, in other words, to have a grid of strikes. You can bring down the whole financial system. Just bring it down completely. So, we have a lot of power. The question is, what are we asking for? I think we should ask for rewriting corporate law and saying that you cannot buy shares anymore. You have to give them equally to all your employees. Now, I know that sounds extreme, but it's an idea. And my job is to implant dangerous ideas into the mind of the young.
So the second question is very concise, and it brings us back to the core of capitalism. Someone asked, what is constitutive for capitalism for you, if markets are not?
Oh, it's private ownership of tradable shares. It's really very simple. The fact that most people who work for a company do not own any part of the company, And most people who actually own the company do not work for the company. That separation is the height of irrationality. It generates, it begets the cruelty that we had from the British the East India Company to what's going on today. Imagine that you broke down that separation for Facebook, for Google, for JP Morgan. Suddenly you have a complete transformation. You don't do away with markets, but you do away with capitalism.
Okay, now we will come to the questions about pluralism in economics. And the first question that somebody asked is, for you, what is pluralism in economics and how can it be achieved?
I've answered that. Where were you? For me, pluralism in economics is... But I'll answer it once more, because, you know, we need repetitio est mater studiorum. Two things. First, we need to teach with equal passion all different perspectives, especially the ones we disagree with. Especially the ones we disagree with. We have to give them the best chance when we present them to students. Secondly, we have to do it in parallel with a history of capitalism that explains where those ideas came from. Why was it, for instance, that David Ricardo, who loved Adam Smith and who loved capitalism, suddenly went crazy in the early part of the 19th century? The reason is the Napoleonic Wars that made a lot of money for landowners in Britain as a result of the eradication of international trade, the lack of imports. And after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, they wanted to stop imports so that they could keep their rents. And Ricardo went crazy, and he came up with the concept of rent, and he differentiated rent from profit. This is what we teach our students. But unless you teach them this from a historical perspective, in the context of the Napoleonic Wars, it will go in one ear and exit from the other ear.
All right. I'd like to believe that there's economics students out there who feels a little bit lost after this lecture, and who actually asked that with a lot of theories around, but not being true, but still being taught, with what mindset should I approach them while studying economics so I won't get lost in them? And maybe a follow-up practical question, is there an economic textbook that you could or would recommend to a current student of economics?
Okay. First question. You should approach every model, every theory with enthusiasm, because they are all beautiful, independently of whether they're useful, toxic, whatever. They're all beautiful, okay? And so, you know, you just have some fun while you approach them and you study them. There are two ways in which you should be critical of every theory. Two ways. They're very different and equally important. The first one is internal criticism. That is, say, okay, so what are your assumptions? Give me your assumptions. Okay, I'll take them for granted. I won't challenge them. Now let's see whether your conclusions are logically the result of a process beginning with your assumptions, because a lot are not. There is a lot of sleight of hand in economics. Many economists, I'm afraid, especially the second-rate ones, not the first-rate ones. The second-rate ones, they're a bit like, you know, cardinals, who are, you know, more papist than the Pope, right? And they cut corners. And you can easily expose them, and you say, look, what you just said does not follow from your own assumptions. I'm not going to criticize your assumptions. That's really very important. An aside regarding this, one of the greats of economics, of neoclassical economics, is of course Kenneth Arrow. You've heard of Arrow-Debré theorems. If you've studied economics, Arrow's impossibility theorem. Kenneth Arrow was one of the first to win the fake Nobel Prize in economics, the Nobel Prize in economics, let's call it. An unbelievable mind, an unbelievable mind. I remember he taught me a huge lesson. It was 1991. I was visiting New York, and he was already an old man, and he was giving a talk at NYU. I'm not exactly, NYU, Columbia, I'm not exactly sure. Small seminar room, about 15, 20 professors. I was the youngest there at the time. And so, he fills all the boards full of equations. One of the professors, it was an academic seminar, says, Professor Arrow, I think that 3.1, and especially the lemma that corresponds to that, probably indicates that a lump sum tax would not be as efficient as a pro rata tax. And Arrow looks at him and says, my dear chap, you're confusing that which is interesting with that which is useful. This is interesting. It is not useful. If you try to apply it to tax policy, you'll be dangerous. Okay? So that's something you can do. It's fun doing it. The second kind of criticism is external criticism. To say, hang on a second, what's this assumption of yours here? You're assuming that people maximize something called utility. Let's look at it philosophically. Does it correspond to introspection? Is this what I do in life? This is a more philosophical critique. Okay? Every theory has its assumptions. All of them are questionable. So, criticize the way in which assumptions are used in order to derive theorems, and then criticize the assumptions. That's the answer to the first question. As for textbooks, look, will it sound awful if I tell you that at some point I had to write a textbook because I couldn't answer that question? There.
Okay, so we have one more question for you. What can economics contribute in the discourse of climate change and challenges the society is facing through it?
Thank you. Did you notice that the US Treasury Secretary, a week ago, 10 days ago at Davos, tried to denigrate Greta by saying, go to college and study economics and then come back and explain it to us. I tweeted, unfortunately, he has a point, not for the reason that he says, but because if Greta goes to college to study economics, her soul will most probably be crushed. And that's a very efficient way of getting rid of her. And immediately, I got a torrent of abuse from colleagues, economists, understandably, who said, come on, Янис, you know very well that economics, what we teach our students, contains a lot of concepts that are extremely useful for understanding climate change, market failure, and so on, which is completely true. The concept of externality, adverse selection, informational asymmetries. You can use all those concepts to explain why markets fail and why, in the case of climate change, they fail so spectacularly that they will destroy human life on this planet. So there is no doubt. But the point I was making was that for Greta, if she were to study economics, to get to those concepts, she would first have to go through the normal standard model in which there are no externalities, you have perfect competition, everything works angelically, and then externalities are presented as an exception, an externality, something external to the mainstream, to what really is going on in the marketplace, okay? But it's not just that, because somebody would then say, okay, so why don't we just reverse the order of teaching? We can start with the externality and then teach competitive markets, of efficient competitive markets. Well, you can't do that, because the moment you introduce externalities, you can't solve the mathematics. You have no demand curves. You have no supply curves, or the demand curves you have are very funny looking, like the market for lemons, George Akerlof's model, and it really, you can't build the whole panoply of economics textbooks on the basis of externalities. So there is an inherent bias in mainstream economics against treating climate change as the real game in town, with fictitious markets that work perfectly in some realm of our collective imagination. That's it.
Well, thank you very much. In fact, we're very happy that someone in the audience asked that question, because as it happens, if you're interested in the topic of ecological economics or economics and sustainability, we're organizing a lecture series, the same that has been organized for this semester, but with the topic of ecological economics, economics and sustainability, starting in April at this university, and we would love to see some faces again next semester for this lecture, for that lecture series.
And now we want to
Attend.
thank Professor Янис Варуфакис for his talk and his presence here tonight. And we want to thank the wonderful audience here and in the other lecture halls, and also all our helpers that were here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.